Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We've reached the peak of this severe weather sequence that we've been talking about over the past several days. Today we have an enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, for parts of eastern Kansas into western Missouri and northeast Oklahoma, including places like Kansas City down to Tulsa, with a very large slight risk area extending all the way up into the northern plains and into states like Minnesota and the western half of Iowa. As we've talked about before, this is kind of a bimodal type setup, two different focal points for the most intense severe storms today. One is going to be up here to the north in the northern portion of the risk area, eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota, western Iowa. And then the second one is down here to the south, demarcated by this enhanced risk area, Kansas City to Tulsa. There is going to be an all hazards threat today. There is a 5% tornado risk extending from southwest Minnesota all the way down the cold front into eastern Kansas and northeast Oklahoma. I've received a lot of questions about whether or not the SPC may upgrade to a 10% for some portion of this tornado risk area. And we're going to go over in this video why some of the negating factors for the tornado risk today and why they've probably kept it at a 5% for now. Damaging wind also going to be a threat, especially down here in the southern portion of the risk area, 30% area from Kansas City down into northeast Oklahoma, and a large hail threat today, perhaps a significant hail threat, 30% hatched area for that enhanced risk zone for eastern Kansas, western Missouri, northeast Oklahoma, large 15% hatched area surrounding that, including the Oklahoma City metro area. So we could see some beefy hailstones today, 2 to even 3+ inch hailstones with some of these supercells today. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. This is our water vapor satellite imagery, as we always take a look at first here on these videos. And this is just a beautiful map, pretty much some eye candy here for the weather nerds out there, including myself. You can see here off the east coast, Tropical Storm Ophelia making landfall this morning on the North Carolina coast. And then here over the northern plains, we have this little swirl here, this little tightly wound swirl across the Wyoming, South Dakota region. That is our main player for today, at least for the northern portion of the risk area. And you can see that it is already initiating some storms here across eastern Nebraska. And this is actually going to be our main severe risk for today, at least one of the main bands of severe risk for the northern portion of this risk area. You can see it's kind of a bow echo, a band of storms here across eastern Nebraska, moving pretty quickly into Iowa. These storms are elevated at this point, as we'll take a look at some soundings in a second, but these storms are elevated, probably will have a tendency to become surface-based as they continue on into Iowa by late morning into early afternoon. And we should see additional development to the north and northwest of this ongoing band going into the late morning and early afternoon hours today. Down to the south, not much going on. A few storms here in eastern Kansas moving into northwest Missouri. These are much more isolated, as you can see, and probably won't pose any negative impacts to the environment. And farther down to the south, we are perfectly clear as well. So back to our water vapor satellite imagery. You can see this kind of westerly flow here across the central portion of the country. That is the top of a ridge of high pressure centered across central Mexico into West Texas. And there is a bit of a disturbance going to be rounding the top of this ridge between this trough up here and this ridge to the south. You can see that the winds aloft might be spreading apart quite nicely out here across the central and southern plains, and we're going to be in an area of strong defluence, or the spreading apart of those wind vectors here across the southern plains. And even though the forcing is going to be more subtle to the south, we should have that strong defluence aloft. And we talked about this before. As those winds spread apart aloft, that creates a void. Mother Nature doesn't like that void to be there, so what happens is air is brought up from below to fill that void, and that's how you get large-scale rising motion for ascent. And that is going to be enough to initiate storms here, plus the frontal boundary at the surface here across the southern portions of the risk area today. Let's look at our upper air maps, and you can see what we're talking about here. This is at 500 millibars, so about 18,000 feet in the atmosphere. Couple features you notice. Here's Tropical Storm Ophelia here on the North Carolina coast, center of our main trough situated in northeast Wyoming at the moment, and that is going to continue off to the north to the east and east-northeast today, going into the afternoon hours. Belt of enhanced flow rounding the base of that trough, so definitely a mature trough. It's taken on a very much negative tilt compared to the last couple of days when most of this flow was relegated to the backside of the trough, which you could tell at that point it was in its maturing phase. Now certainly a very mature trough, closed trough here at 500 millibars with definitely a negative tilt here. So you have that to the north, ridge to the south here across western to central Mexico, and some enhanced flow atop that ridge. That is going a little. You can see a few little disturbances there atop the ridge. Those are going to move into the southern plains today and help initiate our storm coverage this afternoon. Now, as you might expect, now that we have this trough that's traversed the Rockies and this belt of strong flow that has come across the Rockies, we have had a surface response, much more so than the past couple of days. We've been lacking in that department for the last couple of days because this trough has just been lagging back here to the west, not really traversing the Rockies. Well, it's finally ejected, and finally we've seen a surface response with that. We have a surface cold front in place somewhere in this vicinity right now. We'll take a look at the surface data here in a second. But cold front situated in there. A couple different surface low centers possibly, with one main kind of broad surface low center here across the central and southern plains. This is going to move off to the east and northeast today as we go into the afternoon hours. So let's take a look at that surface data to see what is going on. And I'm going to start here in kind of this central sector so we can just pick out the features, and we'll zoom into our more distinct areas here in just a second. But this is our latest surface map here, and you see exactly where the cold front is. Westerly and northwesterly winds on the west side of this boundary, more southerly flow on the east side of the boundary. So our wind shift, very clear wind shift, somewhere in this vicinity right now, trailing back off to the southwest. We also have a dry line that should be in place today. I'll draw that in green here. So you see 40s and 50s dew points back here to the west, 60s and 70s dew points back to the east. So our dry line probably is somewhere in here, and that is going to move a little bit off to the northeast today. As this cold front progresses, it will kind of set up somewhere here in northern Oklahoma, southern Kansas for our southern mode. And this triple point is going to be a key feature today, as ahead of that is where we tend to see a robust severe weather development in these types of setups. We talked about this before in our previous video, that this has been a setup that we've seen quite often in the past. Our type of bimodal setup where we have our northern surface low up well to the north and our secondary surface low or triple point to the south. This is the Davies paper on the Joplin tornado. I put the link to that I'll put the link to that in the description box below once again, so you can do some research on your own. But this tends to be a setup where we see significant severe weather in this southern risk area in this type of a setup. So cold front situated in that vicinity somewhere, dry line there, triple point will move off to the east. Now, given that the trough, the forcing is much, much stronger to the north with this upper level trough, the surface response will be very similar. We'll see a much more robust surface response here in terms of the progression of the cold front. We'll see a much more progressive cold front here in this northern mode. So there will be a lot of frontal forcing here, as well as a lot of synoptic scale forcing for ascent. So to me, there's going to be a lot of storm coverage up here in this northern portion of the risk area today. So discrete supercells might not be a great bet up here in the northern mode. And if there is a window for discrete, it's going to be very quick, I have a feeling. There's just going to be a lot of storms because there's so much forcing from the front and from the trough itself that you're just going to get a lot of storms to go up in this environment. Down to the south, the forcing is much less here. You see very subtle flow, very subtle zonal flow here rounding the top of this ridge that will impinge into the Kansas-Oklahoma vicinity by this afternoon. So much less forcing. That means the cold front's not going to be as progressive later on. So the cold front will make some eastward progress here and probably set up somewhere in northern Oklahoma, southern Kansas by later today. And then just kind of sit there. It's not going to move that much off to the east. Very stalled sort of cold front here. And as we know, that's a lot better for more discrete storms. So I do think there will be a better chance, longer window for discrete storms here in the southern mode, especially when you have westerly flow here. Shear vector should be very much orthogonal to the initiating boundary. We'll take a look at that here in just a second as we look at some model data. But there, to me, looks like a much greater threat for discrete supercells here in the southern mode, and that's why I think they have a large hail risk, especially focused here in the southern portion of the risk area, because we have more of a chance for discrete development down here to the south. Let's look at the moisture values. Very juicy air mass extending all the way across this severe weather risk area. 60s dew points all the way up into South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa at this point, with even stronger moisture down to the south. 60s and 70s dew points here in Oklahoma at this point. Oklahoma City at 68, Shawnee there at 70-degree dew point, so very rich moisture here, and we have even greater moisture down to the south in Texas, low to mid 70s here across northeast Texas. That will continue to funnel to the north as we get that surface low to stay put, that cold front to move off to the east. We'll see continued warm, moist advection here into this region, so we should see 60s and 70s dew points by later this afternoon across Oklahoma and Kansas, with the remaining 60s dew points up here in the northern portion of the risk area. So a very robust, very juicy looking air mass here at the surface, very favorable look for severe weather. Let's look at some soundings here this morning. Let's take a look here. We'll first start in the northern mode. Let's take a look at Omaha. This is out ahead of this ongoing band of storms, and this is from just a couple hours ago as I'm recording this, 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time. And you can see why these storms have been able to sustain this morning. We have quite a bit of elevated instability already, about 1,100 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, most unstable CAPE at about 2,300 joules per kilogram. So quite a bit of elevated instability this morning. You see quite a bit of capping there in the low level, so this definitely is elevated instability, and these storms will remain elevated for some time until we get a little bit of warming here in the low levels. And that is also slightly a concern for today. We see quite a bit of cloud cover here associated with this early band of storms to the north here across South Dakota, Nebraska, into Iowa. That may be of concern today as far as getting these storms to the atmosphere to destabilize fully. We are expecting that to happen, and storms should become surface-based sometime in the afternoon, but we'll have to watch that for sure and see how that progresses going into the afternoon. So we should see some decent instability here. Wouldn't think that these instability numbers are going to grow all that substantially. Maybe at most about 1,500 to 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, but of course that is more than enough for severe weather. Right now, the hodographs look very favorable for severe weather as well. A little bit of curvature there in the low levels, not too much at this point. That should change as we go into the day as that surface low ejects and that trough ejects off to the east as well. We should see those surface winds back and strengthen and hodographs lengthen, so we should see those hodographs really start to curve there in the low levels, favoring a tornado threat with any more robust updrafts and any more discrete updrafts, which again may be a little bit difficult in that northern environment. So these storms will persist into the afternoon. We should see additional development here around the fringes of this ongoing activity in a very favorable environment for severe weather. Large hail may not be too much of an issue, although we have what appears to be a pretty nice elevated mixed layer here that has been transported out across the region. Very steep lapse rates here aloft. Large instability here near the freezing level, which is right in here. So that should favor a large hail threat with any more discrete updrafts. Again, storm mode is going to be of concern. If we see more of a clustered linear mode, hail will not be as much of a threat in this northern portion. It will be more so a tornado and damaging wind threat with any of those storms. Let's go to the south now, Springfield, Missouri this morning, and you see basically the same type of environment here, a little bit different hodographs here. At this point, we have more northwesterly flow in the upper levels. Deep layer shear, favorable at this point for severe weather, and should continue to strengthen throughout the day, about 32 knots of effective bulk shear at 7 a.m. So decently long hodographs, some curvature there in the low levels, and again, that will continue to increase going into the afternoon and early evening hours and be a favorable environment for all hazards. And you see, once again, steep lapse rates aloft. We should be able to grow this instability as we have pretty much clear skies across this region going into the time that we're recording this. So very clear skies. We should get those temperatures up probably into the upper 80s and 90s by this afternoon. So initially, that may allow the temperature dew point spreads to stay on the higher side. So storms may tend to stay a little bit more outflow dominant. Tornado threat may be a little bit less early on in this event for the southern portion. Before we go into the early evening hours when temperatures come down, the storms get into the little bit better moisture to the east, those upper 60s and 70s dew points to the east, then those temperature dew point spreads will come down, and any discrete convection will have an increase in tornado potential going into the evening hours. But decent look for severe weather going into the morning, and that should only increase as we go into the afternoon hours today. All right, how about some model data? 12Z NAM, hot off the press, coming in as we speak. So it's initialized, this is at 500 millibars, it's initialized our trough very nicely here, center across northeast Wyoming, strong belt of flow rounding the base of that trough. It's very tightly wound, compact trough. As we talked about, this ridge is kind of shunting the southward digging of this trough. It's kind of going up and over this ridge, but nonetheless still a potent, compact, negatively tilted trough that will continue to eject off to the east as we go into the afternoon hours today. This is at 0Z, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time today. You see a very favorable look for severe weather. Nice compact exit region here across the northern portions of the risk area. Nice defluence aloft as well. Again, that's the spreading apart of those wind vectors in the upper levels here. You can especially see it at 250 millibars there. That is very, very favorable for large-scale forcing for ascent. Down in the southern portion of the risk area, We can kind of see the same thing as this little disturbance rounds the top of the ridge. We see some defluence here aloft. Not quite maybe as much here in the exit region of this trough, but definitely plenty of defluence, strong divergence in those winds aloft. Should allow for large-scale forcing for ascent as well as the cold front. You can see it here a little bit better on the 500 millibar map. Those winds are kind of spreading apart there across Kansas and Oklahoma. So very favorable look. A little bit, you see a little kink there in the flow rounding into Oklahoma and Kansas by the late afternoon and evening hours today. So definitely forcing not going to be an issue for either of these modes. Let's go down to the 850 millibar map. Given that we have such a strong upper level response, we should see that continue into the mid levels. Here, strong low level jet as that surface low and then low level cyclone moves off to the east or east northeast. Very strong low-level jet here across the northern portions of the risk area, and that should continue to increase for the southern portions as well. Going into the early evening hours, you see that low-level jet ramp up just after sunset there across the entire risk area. So that should allow photographs to really enlarge, especially in the northern portion of the risk area. We should see very much enlarged photographs here with this 40-45 knot low-level jet out of the south-southeast. Definitely going to favor large looping photographs and a tornado threat with those storms up there. Let's go down to the surface here, and we'll see how this progresses. So you see broad surface low here across the plains starting out the day. And then as we go into the afternoon hours, we start to see that maybe that little center eject off to the east-northeast, and we'll be probably somewhere here in the Nebraska-South Dakota-Iowa confluence by 21Z 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And so anything feeding up into that, you'll have moisture feeding up into that surface low, and you may have an arc of convection, arc of additional convection developing up there along the cold front there, feeding into the surface low, along with that ongoing activity moving into Iowa from this morning. Down to the south, that cold front is draped across the south, but you can see as we go into the afternoon hours, and I'm going to draw the cold front here right now. So our cold front here at this point is probably somewhere in here. And then as we go into the afternoon hours, we'll go to 21Z here. Cold front is situated somewhere in here. So you can see that it trails off much closer to where it is right now in the southern portions, meaning that the forward progression of this cold front is not going to be as drastic as in the north. You see it's moved quite a bit here in the northern portion of the risk area, not so much in the southern portion. That is, again, because of that strong forcing aloft, translating down to the surface, pushing that cold front off to the east, and again, that frontal forcing, that's just going to allow all that air to rise, and we're going to have a lot of storms fire along that cold front there in the northern portion of the risk area. Not as progressive of a cold front down to the south, so a much better chance for discrete storms down here and less storms overall in this southern mode. All right, let's look at some moisture values here. We'll start, we'll keep the broad view for now, and then we'll zoom in and take some soundings here from the individual regions. Of note, the NAM is definitely still quite a bit farther west than a lot of the other models here, so keep that in mind. We may not see this exact positioning with the pertinent surface features, but nonetheless, it gives us a good picture of the overall environment here that we see at the surface. So here is our moisture here. You can see broad swath of these blue and purples. That is the 60s and 70s dew points here all the way up into the Great Lakes region. That will continue into today. You see by late evening that plume of 70s dew points reaching all the way up into Iowa here. The NAM, again, tends to undermix a little bit. Mixing shouldn't be too much of a concern today since we have some capping that will hold on into the afternoon and not allow that mixing really to happen as fervently, I guess you could say, going into the afternoon, although we will have full sunshine here in the southern portion of the risk area. So we'll have to watch a little bit for those dew points to come down just a tad, but I'm thinking this is a pretty good depiction at least of what things might look like later on into the evening. You see our pertinent surface features there. Cold front draped out across this region here. A little bit of a triple point there as we see, as we've talked about before, that Davies figure, the figure from the Davies paper. A little bit of a triple point there as our cold front / dry line here intersects with that main cold front there to the north. A little bit of a triple point there. And out ahead of that is where we're expecting to see the most robust storm development this afternoon. All right, let's look at some surface features here. We'll start in the northern portion of the risk area here. Let's take one here. This is going to be, I'm going to take one a little bit earlier to the north as this is going to be an earlier threat with the northern mode is we're expecting that trough to eject, and we already are starting to see that forcing impinge into this region. So therefore, additional storm development should continue by late morning into the early afternoon. We already see, as we talked about, storms ongoing across eastern Nebraska, that we'll see additional development going into the late morning and early afternoon hours because the forcing is much ahead of schedule relative to the southern portion. We should see a later initiation of storms in the southern portion of the risk area. But let's take a sounding here from 21Z, and it might be a little bit difficult to get an uncontaminated sounding here, but I'm going to try. We're going to take a couple soundings here from the northern portion. So this is eastern South Dakota. This may be just a tad north of the warm front, as you see more northeasterly winds here at the surface, but nonetheless it gives us a decent picture. And this is going to be the issue. This has been the issue all along with the northern portion of the risk area, is the instability here. Now, I tend to think this is a little bit underdone, but again, it's going to depend on how much convection we get and how cluttered it becomes in the morning, late morning and early afternoon hours. Now, I'm not showing a ton of instability up here to the north. Down to the south, it's a little bit better. A little bit of interesting photographs here. We do have a little bit of contamination. This is down in northwest Iowa. I'm going to try to pick a sounding that is not quite as contaminated here. We'll go southwest Iowa just to see. And yeah, we're seeing a little bit of contamination here, but this is overall a decent depiction of the environment. So you see pretty robust instability, 2,600 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. I find that a little bit on the high side, although we definitely could see that. Not a ton of curvature here in the low levels of the hodograph. Pretty straight hodograph there in the lowest kilometer or two before we start really seeing that veering in the low levels, lowest 3-4 kilometers or so. But these hodographs definitely favorable for a significant severe threat. You see large instability there at the freezing level. So hail, again, pending storm mode, could be of concern, but damaging winds and a tornado threat as well. This is definitely favorable for tornadoes. It's lots of speed shear here in the lowest levels, not a ton of directional shear, but nonetheless, this is a favorable look for tornadic activity. And again, storm mode is going to play a huge role in that going into the afternoon hours. I want to look at the low-level jet here. Let's pick a sounding right in the axis of the low-level jet, see if we can find that, and that may allow our hodographs to be a little bit more curved. A little bit more veering there, about 500 meters squared per second squared of effective storm relative helicity, so certainly large looping hodographs there in the low levels favorable for a tornado threat with some decent instability there as well. So all hazards on the table for the northern mode today. And again, I think tornadoes and damaging winds going to be the main threat, although some instances of hail and more discrete convection will be the main risk. So let's go down to the southern mode here, and I'm going to go back to our dew points. Let's go to the southern portion of the risk area, so the southern plains. We'll take a couple soundings here. Let's go with 0Z, as that is when things are really going to start cranking. We'll take one here in eastern Kansas. How about here in northeast Oklahoma, eastern Kansas, northeast Oklahoma. So this is at 0Z, eastern Kansas. You see, again, a favorable look for severe weather. Not quite as much curvature in the hodographs as the northern portion of the risk area, but still very favorable look for an all hazards threat. Long hodographs there, 30 plus, about 35 knots or so effective bulk shear, plenty of shear for supercells, and much larger instability than farther north. Again, we're not going to have to deal with that morning convection in the southern mode. So lots of instability here, 4,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. That is pretty impressive. Lots of instability there surrounding the freezing level. So that is going to favor a significant hail threat with these storms today. 83/74. Initially, storms may fire a little bit farther to the west in the slightly less favorable moisture. So we could see, I'm going to take a sounding here back out to the west just to show you what the initial environment might look like. And you can see those temperature dew point spreads are much more on the higher side. 86/65, probably temperatures a little bit higher than that. So maybe toward 90/65 or so. So initially, the storms may tend to be a little bit more outflow dominant, a little bit more high based, and therefore we could see more of a hail and wind threat early on. But as the storms move on to the east and get into this slightly better moisture out to the east, as well as we see those temperature dew point spreads come down just naturally based on the cooling of the surface temperatures as we go towards sunset and just after. And as they get into this moisture, those temperature dew point spreads will come down very, very nicely, and therefore we should see a tornado threat start to develop with especially any discrete convection in this environment. Let me close these out just so I can keep things in line there. So this is going to be in northeast Oklahoma as well. So again, you see a very favorable look for severe weather. Large hail certainly a concern here, especially early on as we have a little bit weaker low-level shear to start as well, and large instability. That will favor a large hail threat early on with discrete supercells, and again, a much more favorable look for discrete supercells in this southern mode. So definitely a greater threat for significant hail stretching all the way back down to the Oklahoma City metro area. This is down in northeast Oklahoma. That is a pretty classic look for all severe hazards here. You see a very nice veering of those low-level winds with height, nicely curved hodographs there. This is a very favorable look here. Large instability, 4,000 plus joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. A nice looping hodographs there in the low level, strong deep layer shear for supercells, 40 knots of bulk shear. You can see all the analogs here. I don't really talk about these analogs all that much, but you see quite a few analogs for both tornadic supercells and severe hail with this setup. So once again, this is a setup that has had my attention for quite some time because it has harkened back to some previous setups, very similar setups, where we've seen some significant severe weather in the past. So very favorable look, and I'm going to go to 3Z here, as this is when we should see we'll continue to see storms ongoing, and we'll start to see that low-level jet really ramp up in the southern portion of the risk area. So you see we maintain that environment going into the evening with large looping hodographs there into the evening. So an all hazards threat, especially with discrete supercells, moving to the storms will be moving to the southeast today, given flow that is more out of the west or west northwest today. Just as a quick note, let's take a look at our shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. We've already determined that the storm mode, the forcing here in the southern portion of the risk area is going to be much more favorable for discrete storms, much more subtle forcing. So here is our boundary. Here's our dry line / cold frontal boundary. It's a little tough to put it in, but we'll just draw it in kind of like that. Shear vector is very much orthogonal to that boundary. Even up here along the main cold front here into eastern Kansas, shear vectors have a nice perpendicularity to the cold front. So much better chance for discrete storms down here in the southern portion of the risk area in this enhanced risk, and therefore that will increase these chances for large hail and eventually tornadoes, especially as we go towards sunset and just after. Very favorable looking environment for all severe hazards in this setup. All right, let's look at some convective allowing model data. This is the 12Z HRRR run. So I'm going to start here. We'll start here in the northern portion of the risk area. I'm going to go to our northern plains sector. So you see this, it's initialized this ongoing activity across Nebraska very well. And watch what happens as we go into the morning. You see that activity continue, and you just have a lot of rain and storms and showers out here across South Dakota into southwest Minnesota and Iowa. That, again, is going to be a little bit problematic possibly in keeping instability down. We'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. But we will see that activity continue and probably become surface-based as it moves further into Iowa by this afternoon. Perhaps a damaging wind, mostly a damaging wind threat, and perhaps a tornado or two in this environment or in this complex there, with additional development back up into the surface low up here into eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota. That could have a tornado threat as well as some instances of large hail. And you just see a lot of convection there, just a lot of different updrafts in here. And it's going to be, there may be a few discrete storms in there, but it might be like finding a needle in a haystack. You're just going to have, and there will probably be a few tornado reports, but they might be very difficult to see. You're going to have to be on the right storm at the right time, which is going to be tough because there are going to be so many storms to pick from here today. It's just going to be a little bit on the cluttered side as far as storm mode goes, and that will continue into the afternoon and evening hours. We see additional development into Iowa, perhaps some supercells along the actual cold front going into Iowa by the evening hours. Let's go down to the south here on this 12Z HRRR run and see what is going on. So much clearer to the south, not much going on here going into the morning and afternoon hours. And then by early evening, late afternoon, early evening, we start to see development here. This is at 0Z. Starting to see development here across eastern Kansas, western Missouri, some supercells in there as well. And then we will see further development down the line going into the evening hours. Again, much later development of storms here in the southern mode because of that little bit later arrival of the forcing here in the southern portion of the risk area. But you do see some semi-discrete supercells here, some tail end Charlie action there across eastern Oklahoma there. That will need to be watched for an all hazards threat as well. Eventually, things will get a little bit on the clustered side here. Going into the evening hours, we kind of maintain that tail end Charlie, interestingly, into southeast Oklahoma, but more of a clustered mode for the most part, eventually, as the evening and nighttime hours wear on. All right, let's look at some other data. This is the, let's go to the NSSL WRF model here, just another one of our models. So you can see that activity in Nebraska and Iowa continues into the afternoon hours, and then you see additional development here along the cold front. And interestingly, you see a very isolated supercell here pretty early on, 20 to 21Z. Not sure I quite believe that. I wonder if this model is picking up on some sort of prefrontal convergence boundary that is allowing for development earlier on than expected. So you see here the main front is back in here. We may have a little bit of a convergence boundary somewhere in here just ahead of the front. We've talked about this before. These prefrontal confluence bands can sometimes be the subtle forcing that is needed to initiate supercells out ahead of the line. So we'll have to watch that for sure. I wonder if any of the other models pick that up. Just kind of thinking out loud here. Let's take a look at the NAM. So this is at 0Z, it's 21Z. So you see our cold front here. Not really seeing a ton of action here, a prefrontal confluence there in northeast Oklahoma this afternoon. Let's take a look at the HRRR and see if that is the case. So you see the cold front back in here. This is at 21Z, 4 p.m. Maybe some subtle convergence in here out ahead of the front, but it's very, very weak, if anything. So, you know, this is one solution from the WRF, NSSL WRF. So this is one model. But it is definitely an interesting solution, as this would foster an all-hazard threat with these supercells, the very isolated supercells here down in northeast Oklahoma, with additional development here to the south across western Missouri. We continue into the evening hours, and that activity kind of lines out fairly outflow dominant there. You see the boundary surging out ahead of the storms there. So interesting solution there from the NSSL WRF for the southern mode. Let's go to the northern mode now and see what happens. So those ongoing storms continue, and we don't see much additional development here back in the heart of the surface low, closer to the center of the trough. But wouldn't be surprised to see a few storms go up here closer to the center of the trough in kind of a cold core-esque fashion. But this band will be our main band of severe storms in this northern mode as it plunges into Iowa and Minnesota this afternoon. How about the ARW, WRF ARW? It's only out 15 hours here, so that should be enough. So the WRF ARW, so those storms continue into the afternoon hours, and it looks like behind this main band we are not seeing as much destabilization, so we're not seeing as much storm development behind the main band here out in Iowa as we would expect if we didn't have all this cloud cover in here. So again, this northern mode, lots of failure modes for this northern mode. Storm mode, I think, going to be a main one, and then overall destabilization behind this initial band could be of concern for a more robust severe threat, and those storms continue off into the evening hours. Let's go down to the southern mode here. Whoops, let me go back to the southern mode, Central Plains sector here. So let's see what the ARW has for the southern mode. So you see additional development here, 0Z. This is 21, 22, 23Z there across Missouri, and then additional development down the cold front going into the evening. And you see very much a discrete mode here in northeast Oklahoma, and by this time 3Z, so about 10 p.m. Central Daylight Time, we would see a tornado threat increase as these storms move into the better moisture and those temperature dew point spreads come down. So that will have to be watched. Some of these solutions are pretty concerning for the northeast Oklahoma, southeast Kansas vicinity. If these storms can maintain a discrete nature going into the evening hours, that will definitely foster a tornado threat with those storms. How about the FB3, just for kicks here? Just real quick. You see a very messy mode up there to the north, much more discrete development down here to the south, and then eventually things congeal into more of a clustered or linear mode. All right, that is going to do it for today's video. Once again, large area of enhanced risk stretching from eastern Kansas into western Missouri down into northeast Oklahoma, including places like Kansas City down to Tulsa, with a large slight risk extending up to the north for that northern mode of this bimodal severe weather risk. Tornado threat is there, 5% tornado risk. Again, I don't think they will upgrade to a 10% risk given some of the caveats that we discussed. Storm mode for the northern portion, destabilization, and then for the southern mode, a little bit of an outflow dominant storm mode to begin with, and then we'll have to see how they recover. It's just a little bit too much uncertainty to upgrade the tornado probabilities here within this large 5% area. But nonetheless, 5% tornado risk area extends over a large area from southwest Minnesota down into northeast Oklahoma. Large hail also going to be a threat, especially in the southern mode from eastern Kansas into western Missouri and northeast Oklahoma, and even down into the Red River area, including the Oklahoma City metro area within that large 15% hatched area, with the greatest threat for significant severe hail in that 30% hatched area there, Kansas City down into northeast Oklahoma. With damaging wind also a threat, especially in the southern mode as well. Damaging wind's going to be a threat there. As storms congeal into more of a line going into the evening hours, the wind threat will take over. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.